And before I do that, just a couple of things. There will be some participation in this workshop, so if you do volunteer to share some of your work that we work on in terms of the writing exercises, that's great. I hope you will, but just be sure to say it loud and say it proud, because we've got this microphone here and another auxiliary mic over there that we want to make sure that we pick up what you say. And I'll do my best to summarize what you say, but the louder you can say it and the more clear you can say it, that will help the folks that are watching online. So first of all, thank you for joining us for the 8th Annual Broadleaf Writers Conference. Before we get started, here are some housekeeping announcements to assure that we all have the best conference experience possible. If you have a one-on-one pitch with an agent or a mentoring session that is scheduled, please be sure you arrive 10 minutes before your scheduled time so that the team can be there to check you in. You're going to be great, believe in yourself, and we believe in you. And if you've got one of those sessions signed up, you'll be just fine, so no need to worry or be nervous. The official bookseller for the conference is right out here, out by the double doors in the hallway, Brave and Kind Books. Select titles from our authors, all recommended titles on writing, such as On Writing, are available for purchase. And guest authors will be happy to sign copies, but please do so during breaks and not during sessions. And once again, we're offering a pre-registration special for next year's conference, 2024. This deal not only gives you the first choice of one-on-one sessions next year, pitch sessions with agents, but also gives you 2 days for the price of one. There's a flyer with a QR code in your folder that'll take you to the registration page, and this deal is only good through September 30th. So if you've had a good experience, excuse me, you want to come back next year, or you know someone else that would like to join you next year or come in your place, please be sure to take advantage of that, and the deadline for the early registration is September 30th. In your program and at the info desk, there are links or QR codes for our conference survey. Please take a few moments before the weekend gets too far in your rearview mirror to fill those out. Those really are invaluable to us as we work to design the best conference experience possible, so please do take a moment to fill those out. The planning that we did for this year's conference in terms of sessions and structure and organization was based on the feedback we got from previous conferences. So you're kind of benefiting from that feedback we received from other conference attendees in previous years. So if you could take a minute, it's real easy. It would take you 5 minutes to fill it out. Please do that, because that really helps us plan for next year's conference and helps us create a program that will be beneficial, most beneficial to you. You can also become a member of Broadleaf or renew your membership when you pre-register on our website, and you can do that at broadleafwriters.com. In addition to saving on the cost of registration, you can join us for monthly member meetings, win prizes, and even be featured in our member spotlight. And it's a great way to be active in the writing community at Broadleaf. And additionally, we are a growing nonprofit, and we rely on donations from our community to help fund the operations of the organization. If you want to contribute, you can either do so when you pre-register, or you can visit the donation page on our website. So those are all of the sort of housekeeping issues. One other housekeeping issue, if you do need to leave the session during the session today, during the workshop, feel free to do so. Just be sure to close that door. It's kind of heavy, and it'll kind of bang shut if you just walk out and let it go. So if you could just close that softly behind you, that would be great. And that'll also minimize some of the noise coming from out in the hallway. So I'm Eliot Parker, and I'm a member of the Broadleaf Board of Directors, and happy to be here. I'm also a fiction writer. I write mostly mysteries and thrillers and short stories. My latest book is a collection of short stories called Table for Two. It'll be out next fall from Pegasus Books, and I'm real excited about that. Prior to that, I wrote a book called A Final Call, which is a thriller set in Cleveland, Ohio, with a fictional female homicide detective named Stacy Tavitt. And so the title of this session today is Creating a Compelling Bad Guy or Gal That Readers Are Going to Love to Hate. So we'll get into some of what that is and what that entails. Even if you are not someone who writes mystery or thriller, you may have a circumstance somewhere down the road when you're writing something, a short story, a memoir, even a poem to some degree, or a play, where you need to create a bad guy or a bad gal. And how do you do that to where a reader is going to make a connection with that person? And while they may not exactly like or condone what they're doing in terms of their behavior or their actions, in some ways the reader's going to want to follow along and kind of follow their journey to see, okay, so we've got this person, we've got this gal doing this, why? Why is she here? Why is she doing the things that she is doing? So we're going to kind of bookend our workshop today with a couple of just short writing exercises just to get you thinking about this concept. So the first thing I want you to do, we're going to take just 5 minutes or so to do this, and then we'll get some participation from you and some feedback from you on this. is I want you to think about a book that you've read. It could be one recently, or it could be in the past. It could be a classic novel, a classic story, or it could be something more in contemporary fiction or contemporary literature. But think about a book that you read where there was a villain involved, okay, or a bad guy or a bad gal involved. Why did you keep reading that story, even though that villain was bad? And what was it about that villain that had you hooked as a reader? So think about a book that you've read recently, or it could be a book that you've read in the past. It could be classic literature, contemporary literature, it doesn't matter. But they had to have a bad guy or gal featured in it, or a villain or an antagonist, or whatever term you want to use. What is it, who was that villain, first of all, and what was it about that villain or villainess that made you want to keep reading, made you want to keep following along and being interested in finding out what happened to that person? So we'll take about 5 minutes, and then we'll get some thoughts and comments from you. we'll take just another minute or so to finish up. All right, so you'll finish up that last thought that you're working on, or that last phrase or sentence. Anyone want to share with us a villain or a villainess from a book that you've read either recently or a while back, and who were they, and why did you find yourself connected to that person? Yes, go ahead.
So I chose Dracula from Reluctant Immortal, which is kind of a sequel to the Bram Stoker Dracula.
Okay.
And what's interesting about Dracula is that not only did they take like established literary character Dracula, but sort of like modernize him by making sort of like a piece of X to the main character of the book. So we see this sort of from Dracula, and living with it, and what happens to her with that. So like she's kind of like trying to escape her piece of X Dracula, and it makes it more effective. Not only the monsters be relatable and something that could allow them to try to strengths with these sort of
Yeah, very good, very good. What was the title of it again?
Reluctant Immortals by
Okay, Reluctant. Okay, very good, excellent. Yeah, absolutely. That theme of mistreatment by someone for a variety of different reasons is one that comes up a lot of times in fiction, especially. But when you're trying to establish a villain, or when a writer's trying to establish a villain, if they've been abused in some way in the past, yeah. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
Just tagging off about all the villains that I'm drawn to. I want to know why y'all are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have. I ask that.
Yeah. Why you are the way you are, yes.
There's that struggle, and you can see the struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that's so interesting, you're talking about the Joaquin Phoenix Joker. One of the things that's so interesting about that movie in the canon of Batman is the Joker's backstory is never really identified. If you saw The Dark Knight several years ago with Heath Ledger, he has that one small snippet in the scene where he crashes Harvey Dent's re-election party, and he says, my dad gave me these scars. But that's really the only backstory from him we get. But in the comic book series of the Joker, we never get how he is and why he is the way that he is. But in the Joaquin Phoenix version, we get that backstory. We understand to some degree, or we humanize or sympathize with him to some degree, why he ends up becoming what he becomes. And so that's what makes that such an interesting take on his characters. We never really got a full backstory. And Christopher Nolan didn't want to give us too much of a backstory in The Dark Knight. We just wanted, we just get that little sense, my dad gave me these scars on his mouth, but that's all we get. So that's an interesting layer to that there is this domino or cataclysmic effect of mistreatment and abuse and by others towards someone. Yeah, very good. Anybody else? Yeah, Jeff. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, no. What about them, Neji? Keep on. Yes, very much so.
But, I mean, they're based under
Right.
That's, I want to find that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Very good. Yeah, very good. One more. We'll take one more, then we'll move on. A villain that you read that you kept wanting to follow. Okay, yes, sir. Go ahead.
This is odd, but when you said that the first thing that came to mind for me was not someone I've read about who's never known. Probably Simon Cowell. Something captivating about him is, and he's just telling the truth, whatever that means. But there's something attractive or repulsive simultaneously about that
Yeah.
character. I know that's an exaggeration, really probably is, but
Right.
it's not literature, but it seems like a lot of people.
Oh no, no, that's an excellent point. There's a reason that Judge Judy's show was the most popular television courtroom show ever aired on television, is because you couldn't wait to see what she was going to do or how she was going to respond. Now, there was ultimately an underlying goodness to what she was doing and saying, and yes, she was trying to mitigate this case, and she oftentimes had wise pieces of advice to those people that were in front of her, that were in her courtroom, quote unquote. But she got there in a very interesting way, and you just couldn't wait to see how she was going to react. And sometimes you could have two cases with two similar defendants and plaintiffs that would have similar circumstances, and you thought, ooh, she responded to this guy in the last case this way. How's she going to respond to this guy with the same issues in this case? And you just never really knew. So that idea of yes, there was an underlying goodness to what she was doing, but she had a way of doing it that you just could not. And it's the same way with the People's Court and all those television courtroom shows. There's a reason those were so popular, because you couldn't wait to see how Judge Wapner was going to respond, or Judge Millian, or whoever the judge was at that particular time. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So I studied psychology and the big five personality traits are the narcissism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm like an extremely highly agreeable person. It's like very intuitive. I found out with my personality because I'm an example of disagreeable. And
Yeah.
there's like something still very good, about you trying to do it,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. But I think that most people are more agreeable, and most people are trying to figure out how to be assertive and how to be more disagreeable. So watching people be disagreeable, it registers as like mean or wrong, but also it's like kind of not. We're all kind of studying that to try to figure out that line, because I really know that you're really nice, and then you get pushed too far, get really upset, and then never want to do that again,
Right.
So you just go back to being really nice, and you see people that are very disagreeable, you villainize them, but at the same time they're able to do something that like most of us aren't, and most
Yes.
of us need to be able to do it a little bit more.
Very true, very true. And in Simon Cowell and Judge Judy's defense, they did mellow a lot as they aged. If you watch recent years of Simon Cowell, he's much kinder, and Judge Judy got much kinder as she got a little older. If you watch the early episodes, man, it was pretty harsh, pretty savage, some of the stuff they said. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
The writer I know, Paul Conner, has this really rich man who's really crazy. He can get into these spaces. No background, and I wonder if sometimes an archetype, that kind of character that's been passed down through the house.
It's a good question. We might address that here in just a minute. I'm glad you brought that up about the archetypes, because I think that is an important point. So those were great. So we had some television references, and I've got some on the handout here that I'll talk about, and some good literature references as well. But one of the things you want to think about when it comes to creating a villain that your reader is going to love to hate, or that your reader is going to follow all the way through, no matter what they do or why they do it, is the fact that they need to have some human qualities to them. That they can't just be evil totally for evil's sake. There has to be an underlying reason for why they do that. Back to television, think about the Law and Order shows. One of the reasons those are so popular, and one of the reasons we watch for 60 minutes, is during the interrogation, when the detectives are interrogating the witness that they think, or the suspect that they think is responsible, we learn the underlying reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. Now, we can't oftentimes sympathize with that, nor should we, but we get an understanding for, why did they do that to that other person? Why did they shoot that person? Why did they stab that person? Why did they set that person's car on fire? There has to be a human compelling emotion behind what your villain is doing in order for the reader to follow. That doesn't mean they have to agree with it. That doesn't mean that they have to be like, yeah, I hope they do it again. but there has to be some reason that on some basic human level the reader can connect with that and say, well, you know what, I don't approve of that, that's not how I would do it, I don't necessarily agree with that action, but I understand to some degree why they're doing it, because that's what sets up your conflict. Now your protagonist has not only the crime or the whatever it is to solve, or the revenge to get, or whatever it is, but now they're dealing with a person. They're not dealing with this evil entity that doesn't have a defined figure to them. Now they're dealing with not only a bad thing that has occurred that they're trying to solve, if it's a mystery or thriller story, for example, but they're now dealing with a human being. So that creates all kinds of complex circumstances and scenarios to make that tension between those two characters really, really strong. So I just put a couple of examples that I'll talk about, and I'll skip down on the handout here, and you're welcome to take notes on these. These are your handouts to keep, so feel free to take notes on them if you want, or add things to them. I put some examples here at the bottom. Victor Newman from The Young and the Restless. Here's a television example. Do I have any Young and the Restless fans in the audience? Does anybody watch soap operas anymore? Okay, so my mother has watched The Young and the Restless literally for 50 years. I feel like Victor Newman is a member of my family. Because, so my mom was an emergency room nurse. She worked at night, and so she would go to work about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So she was asleep when The Young and the Restless was on, so she would tape it and then watch it as she was getting ready. So I was coming home from school, growing up, and she's getting ready to work, and there's Victor Newman on the television. And Mom would say, hey, how was your day? Oh, it was fine. Mom goes, oh, no, wait a minute, shh. Victor's talking to Nikki. Just a minute. And so I feel like I know Victor Newman. But he's a character that is certainly a villain, and considered one of the villains in The Young and the Restless. But as time has gone on, a lot of his villainy, when you learn more about why he's doing what he's doing, you understand it. A lot of it is to protect his children, who seem to get themselves in all kinds of trouble. A lot of it is to do the wrongs that have been done to him by someone who's trying to compete for his business interests. They're trying to take the company from him, take money from the company, and so he responds, sometimes very viscerally, in that soap opera. But there is an underlying element. You can understand why he is doing what he is doing. Philip and Elizabeth Jennings from The Americans. Did anybody watch that series when it was on? I'm telling you, I was always probably one of the best television series I've ever watched. If you haven't watched it and you like sort of espionage, spy-type stories, it's great. Basically, it is about the Soviet Union planting Russian spies in America to carry out their goals and their deeds during the early to mid-1980s. And Philip and Elizabeth Jennings are two of the characters. Kerry Russell plays Elizabeth Jennings, and Matthew Rhys plays Philip Jennings. And they do all kinds of terrible things on behalf of the KGB and the Soviet Union. I mean, push people off bridges, break their legs, poison them. I mean, you name it, they do it, because they're on assignment from the Russian government to do this. But at the same time, they're parents trying to raise two teenage children, a son and a daughter, who have very different interests and very different personalities. And so, on the one hand, they're out here trying to do these nefarious things for the Soviet Union, but at the same time, they're trying to be a mom and a dad. And you see how they struggle with that, keeping those two lives separate and making sure their children don't get involved in their livelihood. They don't want their children to do what they're doing. And of course, part of the tension as the series unfolds is they find out what mom and dad are really up to. And the daughter ends up wanting to kind of follow in Elizabeth's footsteps. But what makes it such a fascinating show is you see this human side of them. That they have to go to work, they have to have a job, they have to go to the grocery store, they have to interact in this world that they really don't understand, but they've been put here on an assignment to do something on behalf of a foreign government, to lawmakers, to politicians, to CIA agents, FBI agents. It's a fascinating series. But again, we see that human side of them. We see them being parents on the other side and trying to reconcile that. And we all, if we're not parents, we all know people who are, or we remember our parents working with us, and we know kind of the struggles that exist there. The other example I wanted to mention is Jaws. So here we go. Chomp, chomp. Jaws goes with me every time I give a writing workshop. I teach at Ole Miss, and I have used this book in countless composition, creative writing, research writing classes, because no matter what group of students I'm dealing with, everyone has seen the movie. So I have a good frame of reference. It's like a cult classic. Everyone has seen the movie. Has anyone read the book, by the way? The book is very different than the movie. And I'll refer to this some as we go through the discussion this morning. But here's what Steven Spielberg said about the book. He said, when I was reading this book and decided to make, this was his first movie, really, his first big blockbuster back in 1972. He said, when I was reading this book, which I think came out in late 60s, early 70s, he said, I found myself rooting for the shark. He said, Hooper, who was Richard Dreyfuss's character, Chief Brody, who was, and then Quint, who was Robert Shaw. He said they were so unlikable and so unbearable as protagonists that I was waiting for the shark to eat them. And the shark actually does eat 2 of them in the book, and he doesn't in the movie. So Hooper and Quint both get eaten by the shark. Chief Brody survives, just like he does in the movie. But so one of the things he was trying to do is make this shark, when he decided to make the movie, make the shark more part of the story and kind of change the characters to some degree. But one of the things that you learn about this shark, as you read the book especially, is that a lot of the motivations for the shark attacking those beachgoers at Amity's, not because he doesn't have anything else to do. There's a lot of other factors there, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. Benchley did that, and if you read interviews with Benchley, he said, I had to give the shark a reason for doing what it did. It couldn't just have it be, that it just got turned loose, and now I see the first ankle over here, so I'm going to go have a snack. There's motivations behind that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a character, is why I'm mentioning that. It doesn't have to be a person. It can be some kind of an animal. If you've seen Cujo by Stephen King or read that book, that's a prime example. Pet Sematary by Stephen King, the little cat church. There's a reason for why church does what it does, even though it's a terrible cat. There's a reason Cujo does why it does, because the owners didn't take care of it, if you're familiar with that story. They don't supervise him. They let him go roaming on the farm, and he ends up sticking his nose down in a tunnel and gets bitten by bats. And that's what gives him the rabies, which makes him kind of a rabid dog. So again, irresponsibility of the owners taking care of him is what led him to become Cujo. So those are just some examples in popular culture, and I'll come back to Jaws here in just a minute. I don't know if I can prop Jaws up or not, but there we go. We'll come back to him in just a second. Just some other examples of villains that I think really have these human and appealing characteristics. I'll skip around on this list too. Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. He's done terrible things, but one of the reasons he is the way he is because his psychologist is manipulating him and abusing him in a lot of ways with the therapy that he's given. And we see later on in that book that he transcends sort of the kindness he wishes that the therapist had bestowed upon him in his actions with Clarice. So he's got this tender soft spot for her. And when you read that and you see that in the film, you're like, well, that's how the psychologist should have been really towards him to some degree, to kind of diffuse some of these impulses and urges that he has. And so as a result of that, Heatshutter transfers that over into his interactions with Clarice. That doesn't excuse what Hannibal Lecter did, certainly, in the book or in the film, but you understand if the person that's there to provide you treatment to cure you is taking advantage of that and manipulating you and abusing you, that's not right. And that puts you on a path. If you've already got these deranged thoughts to start with, that puts you on an even slippier slope and makes you a more dangerous person. So that's an example of how you can make a villain, or how a villain was made more human and appealing. Kathy Ames in East of Eden. Has anyone read East of Eden, Steinbeck's? Really, really great. It is basically Steinbeck's interpretation of the Cain and Abel story. So if you're familiar with that, or if you ever want, I think it's his best book. I think it's one of the masterpieces of 20th century literature. But Kathy Ames is the mother of the 2 boys, of Cal and Aaron Trask, and she is, by all accounts, a terrible person. She favors one of the boys over the other. Cal is her favorite because Cal's most like her personality. Aaron is kind of soft and meek and mild and sensitive, and so she thinks he's weak and doesn't want to fool with him. And she ends up destroying the family. She ends up becoming a prostitute. She leaves Adam Trask, the boy's father, to raise those 2 children by himself out in the Salinas Valley, and she goes off and starts a brothel and becomes a prostitute. When Adam and Kathy get married at the beginning, she sleeps with Adam's brother on their wedding night, just because she wants to and because she can, and she wants to see if he's smart enough to figure out. Of course, he doesn't figure out that he does. This is a terrible person. Just a terrible person does terrible things. But you find out what the great thing that Steinbeck does in that book and in so many of his other stories is there's a humanistic element behind it. And you learn that basically she was locked in a room for most of her childhood and left alone, barely fed, not talked to, not allowed to go out and play, not allowed to interact with other people for most of her childhood until she became old enough to kind of get away. So that doesn't excuse her for the terrible things that she does to her family when she has children of her own. But you can understand if that's all you know, if you didn't have any parenting, if you didn't have anyone to kind of show you how to be a human and how to treat other people, you're just going to default to whatever impulses that you have. And so Steinbeck is so good about that in East of Eden and in Grapes of Wrath. I think he's really good about that too in Of Mice and Men when George and Lenny go to the work farm. Oh, there's terrible people at that work farm, and how they treat both of them are awful. But you understand, and to some degree, why they do. It's because if they don't, they're going to lose their job, be kicked off the land, and or killed by the owner of the property. So, really good ways of sort of layering a humanistic element. You don't have to agree with how they treated George and Lenny. You don't have to agree with Kathy Ames and what she does to her two children when she becomes a mother. But you understand that. You understand that there's a basic reason for why that behavior has taken place. We talked about Bram Stoker already a little bit, and Dracula a little bit, so I'll talk about that. Iago in Othello. Anybody read Othello? Remember Othello? One day, a friend of mine who's a literature major and I, we were having drinks, and we had too many drinks, and we had this discussion about if Iago and Kathy Ames had a child, a literary baby, it would be the most evil child ever. It would make, like, Damien from The Omen seem like, something, seem like a nice kid. Anyway, but Iago in Shakespeare's Othello, horrible what he does. And he basically leads to the downfall of Othello's life, his career, and to Desdemona. And it's awful. I think he's probably one of the most evil characters ever created in all of literature. But you understand why he does what he does. It's because he was in line to become the leader of the Navy, or what would have been called the Navy during that period, and he was passed over for Othello. Not only was he passed over for that position by their commander, but he was passed over for a guy who was of darker skin than him, which in that period, if you know from Shakespeare's period, was a real insult. It was an insult to be passed over, but to be passed over by a Moor, is what Shakespeare calls it, an M-O-O-R, was a total insult. And so Iago goes on this revenge campaign. Well, I'll show you I'm smart enough and I'm good enough that I should have been in charge of this group of men, and I'm going to show you just how smart I am. And so he manipulates everybody in the play. And Shakespeare is very good about doing that with a lot of his characters as well. But you understand while you're reading this, despite all the terrible things he says to and about Desdemona, which is just awful. I mean, some of the things, if you ever read that, just terrible misogyny, what he says to Desdemona. Sometimes she gets what he's up to, but most of the time it goes right over her head. But you understand there's a humanistic element for why he's doing what he's doing. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to like it. It may not be how you would do it if you were the character, or how you would write it if you were the author. But you get a sense for why Iago's doing what he's doing, because this is like the penultimate moment of his career. He should have had it, and he got it taken away from him, not based on expertise, but based on likability. That their commanding officer liked Othello's personality, liked him better. And we've all been in situations like that, I think, in our personal and professional lives, where maybe we should have gotten something and we were passed over, and it went to somebody maybe less qualified, and all of that. So some elements there of how you can do that. I put Annie Wilkes from Stephen King's Misery. Oh, she's a terrible character, too, if you've seen the movie or watched that. But you learn a little bit about her, too. I mean, Paul Sheldon has killed her favorite character, and he's not going to bring her back. And we also learned that she lost her job as the one job that she loved, which was being a nurse. And of course, there's reasons why she does that, but she's had a lot of things taken from her in her life, and she lives alone, and she's never been able to really make connections with outside people, and as a result, she lives through Misery Chastain's experiences. So again, it doesn't excuse what she's doing, or doesn't excuse how she behaves and what she does to Paul Sheldon. The book's better than the movie of that, by the way. I mean, she does all kinds of awful things more in the book than she runs over the sheriff with a lawnmower instead of pushing him down the stairs. She cuts Paul Sheldon's foot totally off instead of just breaks his ankles. No, she cuts the foot right off. Just terrible. The book's always better than the movie, except in this case, but which we'll talk about in a minute. But so those are just some examples I wanted to get you thinking about. Some examples, and these are different time periods in history, different authors, different backgrounds. Different plot lines, but you can see how you can work some of those elements of having sort of a humanistic approach or somewhat of a humanistic element to your villain. So what are some of the things that these villains have in common? Well, one of the things that help us, I think, like a lot of these villains that I talked about, is because your writer has spent some time in the shadows with this character. Not just for the bad things that they've done, but why are they doing the bad things that they are doing? So I'm going to go back to Jaws here for just a moment. one of the things, there's so many things that the movie doesn't explain that the book does explain. For example, the book explains why they can never find the sharks. You know, in the movie they do the helicopter flyovers and they're looking for the shark, and Ben and his men go out and they try to find the shark, and then Hooper and Chief Brody find him, you know, his head at the bottom of the boat and all that. Well, they never explained, we have this big, massive shark floating in the waters off of Amity Island. You know, why can't they find him? Well, the book explains that. The book says that at the end of the beach, there's a 75-foot drop-off between the end of the beach and the ocean floor, and that's where the shark hides. So that's why they can't find him. They don't have the equipment to go down that far to find him. So, you know, they're doing the surface looks in the book and, you know, sending boats out. Well, they can't find him because the shark's hanging around down there. And then when they give up and the water calms down, then the shark comes back up and attacks. But one of the other things that happens with this is that we learn in the book, that one of the reasons the shark is starting to prey on the people of Amity Island is because the fishermen at Amity have overfished the waters and its food supply is gone. So you have this creature, and I've read a lot of interviews with Peter Benchley, and he said, I had to give this creature a reason for doing what it is doing. And so what did he do? How did he kind of get in the shadows with a shark, with something that is not human? He spent a lot of time researching sharks, talking to oceanographers, talking to marine scientists about shark behavior, great white shark behavior. What would cause them to come on a human? And we've seen a lot of shark attacks this summer. And oftentimes what it is, and he works this into the book as well, and you know this if you know anything about sharks, you know, when you're on a paddleboard out in the ocean and you're doing this and you're laying on that thing, to you look like a seal to the shark. Or you look like an animal that's in distress. You know, you're churning like this, and you know they can sense the bubbles and the churning and the oxygen in the water, so the shark thinks that you're in trouble and I'm hungry and it's time to eat on you. Well, eventually had to learn all of that in order to figure out, okay, how am I going to make this shark to the level where it's going to be believable when he goes on a rampage and starts eating people, that people are going to be like, okay, well, I understand why you're chomping on Alex Kittner or whoever it is that you're moving on. The book doesn't really, or the movie doesn't really explain that. It just kind of seems like this shark shows up and starts attacking people. Well, the book does explain that. The food supply is gone, so he's going for the next closest thing to survive, because his structure and anatomy is to be a predator and to be a hunter and to be a killer. That's what it's bred to do. And so in order for Benchley to get that right in the story, he had to spend some time kind of wading in those dark waters. He had to kind of become the shark in order to be able to see, how am I going to do this to where a reader's going to follow this along and want to and understand why this shark is attacking people. So that's an example of kind of wading into the water a little bit. And sometimes you have to spend some time with that character and thinking about, okay, what is the human element that I'm going to give them that makes them believable and understandable, but also how can I make sure that the reader's going to say, you know, I don't agree with this, or this makes me kind of sick at my stomach, but I want to find out more. I want to see where the end is coming. So if you're thinking about doing that, that's one thing I would suggest, is just spend a little time. You certainly want to spend time with all your characters and your protagonist especially if you're writing first person, and we're going to follow that protagonist, you know, through their eyes only. You know, certainly spend a lot of time with them, but do spend enough time with your antagonist that you have a way to kind of make them bad and make them do bad things and make them react and respond in bad ways, but also to where the reader can say, okay, I don't agree with this or approve of it, but I see exactly why this is happening. So we have to say, you know, and eventually said lots of times when he was studying about great white sharks that, you know, the hair on the back of his neck would kind of stand up because he was researching shark attacks. You know, at that part, I don't know if you know this, but they shot Jaws up Martha's Vineyard. Is where they shot. Amity Island was basically Martha's Vineyard. I don't know if you knew that or not. But so he studied a lot of shark attacks that occurred in that part of the country, and he said some of the descriptions and accounts, and he looked at pictures of victims, and he said just awful. And he said there lots of times the hair on the back of my neck stood up. But he said I had to wade in that darkness to figure out how am I going to make this shark a believable villain. And then the other problem was he didn't spend enough time with his protagonists, as I mentioned earlier, and he made them so unlikable that Steven Spielberg said, I couldn't wait till they were eaten. And so when he made the movie, he had to make Hooper and Brody and Quint more likable so that you'd watch the movie. So that's an example of how you want to spend as much time with both characters, but do wade in the waters, the dark waters a little bit. And if your kind of hair on the back of your neck stands up, or you You feel your palms kind of sweating after you're thinking about that antagonist. You're heading in the right direction, believe it or not. Or if your husband or wife comes in and says, honey, what do you want for dinner? And you say, I need a minute. I've just been over here fooling with it. Yeah, you're heading in the right direction. You're totally heading in the right direction. So how are some ways we can do this when we wade in those deep waters? You want to go in with some things to think about and some questions to ask yourself and some ways to kind of approach your antagonist, even if it is something not human like a shark. And I listed those there on the handout. One of the ways is to understand that very few villains consider themselves bad. And if you've spent the amount of time kind of giving them and humanizing them to some degree, they rationalize and have rationalized in their mind why they're doing what they're doing. Talked about those Law and Order examples a minute ago. Despite the terrible things that those detectives investigate, that person sitting across from them has a reason and feels justified and feels like they're not totally bad for doing what they did. Jaws doesn't feel, if we were to interview him, doesn't feel totally bad for eating those people because, hey, you guys took my food supply away. What else am I supposed to do? I'm going to go for the next thing that gives me the protein and the energy I need to survive, and that's you on that boogie board, or you on that raft, or you in the water. So you want to think about that a little bit. A lot of villains don't consider themselves a bad guy, and if you would sit down Dracula, or you would sit down Phil and Elizabeth Jennings, or any of these characters we've talked about, or any of the ones that you've mentioned, Simon Cowell, even Judge Judy, they would defend to some degree what they are doing as the right way, that they have an underlying purpose for what they're doing. Now, their methods might be wrong, but Judge Judy says, hey, I've got to give tough love on these knuckleheads. The only way they're going to learn a lesson is by me getting aggressive and in their face and all of that. And so those are just some ways to think about that. Very few villains really consider themselves completely bad. Second tip I put on here is try to remember that every character has a mother. So when you're developing that bad guy or that villain that your reader's going to love to hate, think about that villain has a mother, even if we don't know who that is. And I say that for this. A mother is going to defend their child in most cases. Kathy Ames would not do this. Well, she would for Cal, but not Aaron. But most mothers are going to defend their child no matter what, no matter how terrible they are, no matter how awful they are. And we see this all the time if you watch courtroom television, if you follow trials. At sentencing, who typically stands up and says, my son or daughter is not this monster that the prosecution's painted it out to be? It's usually the mother. So put yourself in that circumstance when you're trying to flesh out your antagonist. Kind of put yourself in the role of the mother and think about, can I, as I'm making this character human, even though they're doing some terrible things, if somebody were to grill me or put me on under oath or put me on the stand and quiz me about it, could I testify and say, yes, my character has done some terrible things, but you also have to understand X, Y, Z. And could you come up with 2 or 3 or maybe 4 points why you could justify that behavior? So if we were to wheel Jaws' mother in here in a big tank, okay, put her here at the end of the table, and we were to say, all right, Mrs. Jaws, we're getting ready, I'm Chief Brody, I'm getting ready to shoot the harpoon into the air tank that's going to kill your son, make me not do it. But what's she going to say? She's going to say, my son is only doing what he is trained to do, anatomically trained to do, which is hunt and kill and be the biggest badass in the water, for lack of a better expression. And he's responding because you all took his food supply away. If you all hadn't overfished those waters, he wouldn't have to come after you. Well, she will, yes. She will. She will say, yes. She will say, I was not around. I should have stayed with him longer. I should have mentored him better, told him to stay away from those human ankles, that those aren't food, no matter how hungry you are. Yes, that is very true. She would test, if we put her under oath and asked her, those would be the things she would tick off. So when you're writing that villain and you're layering those human elements in, think about, could you defend that person if someone or that being or creature, if you were asked, if you were that character's mother, what would you say? And if you really can't find a rational sort of somewhat relatable example or reason for that, you might want to think more about your antagonist. You might want to think more about that villain. Make him more human in some ways. Scale back the criminal behavior he's doing. Scale back the things that he says to other people a little bit. Walk it back a bit. Because you want to be able to kind of tick off 2 or 3 or 4 things in defense of that villain. Because if you're able to defend that as the writer, the reader's going to be able, as they're reading that narrative, to be able to defend that as well. So, when you read this in the book and you see that the fish, and they were warned too. They tell you in the book that they were warned not to overfish the water, and they did it anyway. So, there is those moments where you have to think about, can I tick off a few things that will allow my villain to seem more relatable and more human. And also, I put, and you know this too a lot, if you read a lot or if you've done any kind of writing, that you do want your villain to have a soft spot. You do want your villain to have a weakness, even if they're terrible. Hannibal Lecter's weakness is Clarice, and she sees that, and she exploits that. Kathy Ames in East of Eden, her weakness is her son Aaron. She plays Aaron against Cal so well. And she doesn't have to destroy Aaron in East of Eden because she lets Cal do it for her. Okay? She manipulates them to the point where he does her dirty work for her. So she found that's flaw and that soft spot. But think about what is going to be a weakness or a flaw in your villain's character that can be exploited. Paul Shelton in Misery finds out that if I just keep talking about bringing Misery Chastain back, she's going to leave me alone. Yeah, she cut my foot off when I told her I was going to stop writing the series. But if I'm going to live, I've got to play along here and tell her, yeah, I'm working on the next book now. I need a typewriter. I need some paper. I'm ready to go. I've got the idea. And what does she do? She brings the typewriter and paper in, and she sits over there while he's typing. Well, ultimately, he uses that typewriter and hits her over the head with it, and that's how he gets out of the room. So that's the kind of flaw I'm talking about. Find some kind of a weakness or a flaw in your villain's behavior, actions, character that makes them also seem human, because we all have flaws. But at the same time, it gives that protagonist an opportunity to find a solution, to bring a resolution to that antagonist, whatever that is for you in your story. If that's an arrest, if that's a revenge murder, if that is having them disappear, if that's their car driving off into the sunset, never to be seen again, whatever it is that you want them to do, they need that flaw or soft spot that the protagonist can exploit. Okay? Chief Brody in Jaws exploits the shark's never-ending appetite to eat. And that's how he basically gets in the movie. That's how he gets the shark. He says, "Come on, come on, come eat me. Come on, come on, big boy," and then shoots him. So he exploits that weakness, but that's an anatomical weakness built into the shark's nature. But the shark easily could have just gone away, lived to fight another day. But no, he got a little greedy. He had to go and kill them all. Try to kill them all. And he gets 2 out of 3 in the book. But that's a soft spot that Brody was able. And he's not a scientist. He's not a biologist. He's just a police chief on this small island. But he realizes this thing's going to eat everything in front of it, and so I'm going to get it to come over here, and I'm going to get it this time. So that's an example of that. So think about flaws and soft spots that you have with regards to that. I'm going to turn back over on the back end of the handout and just point out a couple of other things, and then we'll wrap up with a quick writing exercise to kind of close out what we talked about today. Some tips on making really good villains. I think if you're just starting this route, or maybe you're wanting to write a mystery or thriller, or you're working on something, you think, I've really got to have a good antagonist here, somebody that's really mean, really cruel, really violent, but I'm trying to layer him and make him or her a little bit human so that the reader's going to follow along. Here's some other things that I think are helpful about creating good villains. Avoid making the villain a corporation, a disease, or a war. I mentioned The Americans a minute ago. That would have been a terrible series if it was the United States against Russia. Readers can't wrap their mind around that in a 45 to 50 minute television episode. But what you do is you send 2 agents against an FBI agent from America. So you still got the America-Russia conflict, but we've got Philip and Elizabeth Jennings against Stan, who's the FBI agent that's trying to pursue them. And eventually he finds out who they are. But if you make it a disease, if you make it a corporation, if you make it this big, large, esoteric thing, the reader's not going to be able to kind of pinpoint and follow along, and won't want to follow along. There was that movie Outbreak several years ago about the virus that the monkey brings over. Well, that would have been a terrible movie if it was just about the virus. Yes, the virus was an important part of the backdrop, but what made the movie? It was the scientists and the people afflicted, and the scientists trying to find a cure. Yes, this is where the disease came from, this is what it does, but we're going to follow the trajectory of these scientists that are trying to stop it, trying to stop the spread, trying to find a cure, and all of that. So that's what I mean by that. And there's all kinds of examples, certainly in literature as well, of that happening as well. But just try to avoid making it this big, large element. You can use it as a backdrop, you can use it as a subplot, but have something in front of the reader that they can grasp onto and follow. Have it be a character, have it be a couple of characters if you want to do an ensemble story with multiple protagonists and villains, but have something that the reader can kind of identify with. You also want to make your villain at least as smart and or strong and or capable as the protagonist. So Philip and Elizabeth Jennings spend 7 seasons in The Americans, going back to that, getting Stan, who's a very smart FBI agent, he's the chief of counterintelligence for the FBI, off their trail. And just when it looks like he's going to find them and catch him, they do something to grow the trail cold. Ultimately, though, they make a mistake. They get greedy and they make a mistake and they relax a little too much, and Stan exploits that. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're equal in characters, because Stan ultimately prevails in that series if you've watched, or the U.S. prevails, and Philip and Elizabeth Jennings are driven out of the country and back to Russia. Sorry, I didn't mean to spoil that if you wanted to watch it. But they're ultimately driven back to Russia in exile, and they're not welcomed home with open arms. They're seen as failures by the Russian government because they weren't able to do the mission that they were assigned to do. But you have to have both of those, at least for a while, be strong and enough to go head to head, so that you get the conflict and the tension that you need to hold the story together. We have to have it in Jaws. We have to have the shark eating people. We have to have the shark getting away. We have to have the shark hiding under the edge of the beach there. We have to have a lot of close calls with Hooper and Brody and Quint before they finally have the final confrontation. It doesn't mean that the antagonist has to win, but for most of the narrative, they've got to be able to kind of hold each other's own. And depending on the type of story that you want to do, you can set that up in a variety of different ways in terms of how many ebbs and flows you want in your story structure. But you want to make sure that the villain is at least as capable. And he can have that flaw and that soft spot that I was talking about, or she, that opens up an opportunity for the protagonist to win, but they need to be sort of equal in many ways. And if the villain remains hidden, which happens in a lot of mysteries, create proxies that the protagonist must overcome. If you don't want to identify who the villain is at first, then you need to find out other things to get the character, your protagonist, on the trail of finding out who this person is. So back to Jaws, and I promise I'm going to stop talking about it. We don't know what's killed Chrissy at the beginning of the movie or the book. You get a sense that it's something in the book, something large, something strong and powerful, but there's no mention of it, a shark. There's no mention of a shark. In the movie, you obviously know, you see her pulled under, right, if you've seen the movie, but we don't know what's pulled her under. We can't see the shark. We just know she's pulled under. She comes up, she screams for help, nobody comes, and then she's pulled under for the final time and the blood surfaces up. So if you want to do that, and that's a great approach to really hook a reader in, just exactly what is it we're dealing with here. If you've read Stephen King's The Mist, that short story, a great example. That these people are inside this convenience store buying gas and candy and all this, and all of a sudden somebody runs in and says, close the doors, and there's this fog that envelops the whole store. You don't know where it came from, who's responsible, how long it's going to last, what it is exactly until the story goes on. But there has to be proxies, and the proxies in that story are some wise guy decides, well, I'm going to go wade out into the fog, and he wades out into the fog, and you hear a blood-curdling scream, and then there's blood splatter on the glass. Not to be gross, but that's kind of what happens. So that's a proxy. So the people inside are going to think, oh my gosh, we don't know what this is exactly, but we know if we go out there and get involved in it, we're going to end up like that guy. So that's what I mean by proxy. If you want to go that route, if you don't want to identify who your villain is at the beginning, there has to be some proxies, there has to be some breadcrumbs that the reader's going to follow along with your protagonist to find out what's going on here. What's exactly going on here. And in Jaws, it's when Chrissy's body, the remnants of her body, wash up on the shore. That's when they realize, oh, this wasn't a boating accident. She wasn't cut up by a propeller. Something attacked her. And you see that scene in the movie where Richard Dreyfuss's character is doing the autopsy, and he nearly throws up during the search because he's looking at the remains, and he looks to Brody and says, this was no boating accident. This was a monster. This was something strong, deadly, and destructive that basically tore her limbs apart. So that's a proxy. So now Chief Brody's got to think, okay, well, what is it? What could do something like this? And Dreyfuss or Hooper says, the only thing I can think of is a shark, and a big one, a real big one, that could do this kind of damage. So those are the proxies that I'm talking about. So you want to set those up for your reader as much as possible so that they're going to want to follow along and find out kind of where we're headed. And something else to kind of think about too, remember a villain, just like our protagonist, the villains that don't have simple lives, Victor Newman doesn't have a simple life, despite the fact he's rich. Charles didn't have a simple life, despite the fact that it was on the prowl. Kathy Ames certainly didn't have a simple life in East of Eden, despite the fact she's just a terrible character. They're just really one of the worst female characters that I can think of in literature. So your villains don't have simple lives. Villains have their own villains, and they have their own things that they're dealing with, physically, emotionally. So set those up. Spend some time kind of waiting in the shadows. Think about, okay, if I'm going to defend this villain, I have to layer it with some humanity, him or her with some humanity, so that if I'm the mother of that villain, I can defend 3 or 4 reasons for why he or she's doing what they're doing. And then think about, okay, how can I make these two, this villain and my protagonist, shoulder to shoulder, but then what's the soft flaw that the villain has that my protagonist eventually is going to be able to exploit? Doesn't mean the protagonist wins at the end of the story, but the reader wants to see the villain eventually get something that's coming to it. And you determine it. The great thing about being a writer is you determine what that is. Is that exile, like in The Americans? Is that being blown to pieces, like the shark in Jaws? Is that basically dying as a prostitute, like Kathy Ames? I mean, what is it? What is it that you ultimately want to have happen to your villain? But if you kind of work through that process and really spend some time humanizing them and thinking about what makes them dark and kind of what makes them tick and what makes them relatable to an audience, you're going to have a great villain that every reader is going to want to follow. Doesn't matter if you're writing romance, science fiction, mystery thriller, memoir, whatever. You'll have that character that the reader really, really wants to follow. One more example of memoir. Any memoir writers in here? Okay, one. If you haven't read Jeanette Walls' The Glass Castle, she does a wonderful job at making, and of course that's true, but she does a wonderful job of balancing the terrible things that Rose and Rex Mary Walls do to their children with kernels of humanity. And you learn why Rex Walls is the way that he is and why Rosemary Walls is the way that she is. It doesn't mean you condone or approve of their behavior, but she sprinkles that in and structures that memoir in such a way that just when you have had enough of those two, as parents, they do something that makes you see, oh yes, they are a mom and a dad. So you can do it in memoir too. It doesn't have to be, this is not just a fiction thing. So I wanted to mention that example too. All right, last thing I want to do just quickly, we have just a couple of minutes here. You can go back to that character that you were writing about earlier, or you could pick someone else. And I want you to play the character's mother, even if you're a male. You could be the dad if you want to be that. But think about that character. And if we were going to put you on trial down here, like we were going to put Jaws' mother in the big tub of water on trial down here, what are 3 or 4 things that you would say in defense of that character? So you could use the same one that you wrote about, that same villain from earlier. If you want to switch it up and pick somebody else, maybe I want to write about whomever. What might be 3 or 4 things if we were going to put that character on trial down here and make you defend that character in terms of their humanity or their rationale for why they do what they do? What might be 3 or 4 things you would say? And we'll take just a couple minutes with that, and then we'll share some responses. I also put on the back of the handout, if you want to learn more about this concept of villains and writing really strong villains that readers are going to love to hate, I put some resources back there. Some really good texts that kind of go into a lot more detail about this. It builds on some of the points we've talked about, but goes into a lot more detail. We just didn't have time to get to everything today, but those are some good resources too that I wanted to share with you. So we'll take just a couple minutes with that. So if you had to put them on trial as the mom or dad, what would you say? We're almost out of time, so we'll take just about a minute on this. So maybe 2 things. You can't get 4 or 5. If you get 4 or 5, that's great. But a couple things. If you had to defend the humanity of your villain. All right, so anybody want to share with us quickly? Did you keep your same villain from earlier, or did you change it up? Let us know that, and then what are a couple things that you would defend some of their humanistic or human approaches? Jeff, I'm going to pick on you because I'm not picking on Jeff, but I locked eyes with him first. Yeah. So the sense of justice and the sense of, we're just trying to improve, we got to look out for ourselves, take care of ourselves, and we have some obstacles here that need to be. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Now, we don't have to agree with that if you've read Les Mis, and we don't have to think that that's the right way to handle that, but we can say, well, you know what, I can see that, because at some level, we all feel that way about our lives. We want to have the best lives possible, and we want everyone to be treated equally, and when people don't do what they're supposed to do, to be held accountable for that. So yeah, that's good. Anybody else?
I did Section from Lincoln Highway. He's sort of a bad, he's sort of a bad guy, but
Yeah.
he did a great job of making him very relatable. You see it from different voices, from his friend's point of view, but also from his own voice.
Yes.
And I guess if the mother was going to justify his actions, he really did, a lot of his actions came from a good place. He thought he was doing the right thing.
Right, because he doesn't think he's doing bad, right?
He doesn't think he's
Right.
doing bad. He thinks he's helping out a friend.
Uh-huh.
He also, his father was a good jerk. So his father was a jerk. The apple was a faulty Washington.
Yep.
And she wasn't around.
Very good. Last time I did this workshop, I had someone use Training Day as an example, and with Denzel Washington's actions, the dirty cop. If we would put his character's mother down here and ask her, she would say, you know what, the only way he can get inside those gangs and those cartels is to be their friend, and he's got to give them, a little bit here to get their cooperation. If he didn't, think of all the other crime that would happen. He would never get to make these arrests, and we'd never have the information that we have. Of course, Ethan Hawke's character is the total opposite. He says, well, no, we're going to do this by the law, not your way. But again, that's an example of, you could see, a mother saying, my son's trying to do the right thing, and if he doesn't give them a little money, give them a little drugs here to get their cooperation, think of where we would be, think of where our city would be. So that's just an example of, but that makes you want to watch. You can't wait to see what Denzel's going to do next. Who's he going to bribe next, or what's going to happen when he and Ethan Hawke fight over he goes too far, or Ethan thinks he's gone too far. I can't remember his character's name. When he's gone too far, what's that argument going to be like? So all that stuff makes your villains so interesting, and you'll have a great villain that your reader will love to hate. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks for participating and everything.